SBO is the best.
Alright, let's lock in. So in this video, we're going to look at what aerobic and anaerobic exercise actually mean, the word equations that you need to memorize for this AQA course, how to justify which one is happening in sports, so whether it's aerobic or anaerobic, and what epoch is, and also what oxygen debt is, which is basically the same concept, and why you breathe heavily after intense exercise. And lastly, we're going to finish up talking about recovery methods that you need to be able to understand and evaluate. So, simple definitions for aerobic and anaerobic. Whenever you hear aerobic exercise, that means exercise that is performed in the presence of oxygen. So, in other words, your muscles are getting enough oxygen to keep producing energy. Meanwhile, anaerobic exercise means exercise is performed in the absence of oxygen. It doesn't mean that there is zero oxygen in the body. It just means that the intensity of the exercise is so high that the oxygen delivery doesn't keep up with the demand for oxygen. So, in a nutshell, if there's enough oxygen available, it's aerobic. If there's not enough oxygen available for the demand, it's anaerobic exercise. And these are the word equations. The word equation for aerobic exercise, we have glucose plus oxygen equals energy plus carbon dioxide or CO2 plus water or H2O. But word equation, you wouldn't use the symbol, so it's written out in full. And then anaerobic exercise equation, we have glucose gives you energy plus lactic acid. Okay, so quick recap, aerobic and anaerobic exercise both use glucose. They both use glucose, but for aerobic, it needs oxygen. So it uses oxygen and it produces CO2 and water. And also aerobic exercise is usually long duration plus low to moderate intensity, and they both release energy. Obviously, that's the whole point. And then we have anaerobic exercise. Anaerobic exercise starts with glucose as well, but there is not enough oxygen, which is what leads to the production of the byproduct lactic acid. And lactic acid builds up in the muscles, which is linked to fatigue and the burning feeling that you feel in your muscles. So again, that's just how you should be able to distinguish between anaerobic and aerobic. Any activity that is low to moderate intensity, such as a marathon, is mainly aerobic, and any activity that is very high intensity and short duration, so very high intensity plus short duration, is likely mainly anaerobic. So 100-meter sprint, 200-meter sprint, like that. These are even some more examples that you might want to use. You might want to list out when you're answering any questions in an exam when they require you to give examples. I've intentionally put games in between both anaerobic and aerobic because usually during games you have periods of really intense activity followed by periods of rest. EPOC, which stands for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, is also known as oxygen debt, and it happens as a result of anaerobic respiration, which requires extra oxygen to be inhaled. So we can use this graph to more accurately describe what we mean by oxygen debt or EPOC. So this graph shows oxygen consumption when you start exercising up until when you stop exercising and when you enter the recovery stage down here. So before you've even started exercising, you're consuming oxygen at a very low rate because you're in your resting state. And then we get to this point where you start exercising, and you start exercising intensely, anaerobically. Maybe you start sprinting uphill. This gap right here, which I'm gonna shade in purple, this purple gap right here represents something known as oxygen deficit. And this oxygen deficit basically means your body can't take in oxygen quickly enough to match the demand for oxygen of the activity that you are doing. So this is the oxygen deficit. Oxygen deficit. So your body basically owes more oxygen to the muscles because it hasn't provided enough oxygen during this start when you started doing the sprint or whatever intense activity you were doing. And then fast forward to when you finish exercising, you've sprinted up the hill, and then you stop, and then you start resting. This area here is going to be your epoch, which I'm going to shade in red. This area is your epoch, or your oxygen debt, and that's where your body starts to repay the oxygen that you didn't have at the start of exercise. So that's what we mean by epoch, and that is how you can demonstrate epoch or oxygen debt on a graph to make it easier to understand. And that epoch is important during the recovery phase after you finish exercise, because it helps to be able to replenish your energy systems, and it helps to remove waste products like lactic acid. And that is why after you've done some intense exercise or activity, your breathing remains elevated for a while, which takes us really nicely into recovery methods from vigorous exercise. So you need to know these three methods. You need to know about cool down, diet manipulation, and ice baths or massages. So we're going to start with cooling down. So cooling down is important because it helps to maintain an elevated breathing rate and heart rate, and it involves stretching, and it also helps to remove lactic acid. So cooling down in a nutshell is important because you don't want to go from 100 to 0, right? You don't want to do a workout and then just stand still and then just stop. A cool down helps to keep the blood moving around, it helps to keep your breathing up, and it helps your body to gradually shift from hard work mode into normal mode. So an example of a cool down could be a 5 to 10 minute light jog or a walk after a match, or it could just be some gentle stretching after the match. And then next we have manipulation of diet. So this includes getting rehydrated, so rehydration, and consuming carbs for energy. So rehydration and carbohydrates, because after exercise you have lost a lot of water and some salts through the sweat that you sweat. So rehydrating helps with recovery, and carbohydrates helps to restore your energy stores so that you can perform again. So an example would be a footballer rehydrating after a training session, or a marathon runner and endurance athlete using carbohydrates post session to be able to get ready for their next session. And we have ice baths and or massages. So the main benefit of this is that they prevent DOMS. They prevent DOMS. So if you don't know what DOMS stands for, DOMS stands for delayed onset muscle soreness. And DOMS is muscle soreness that tends to show up later on after hard or a new unfamiliar exercise, especially when there's a lot of eccentric work going on. But when you are referring to cold water or ice baths, when you're evaluating them, you could also mention that with ice baths or cold water, there is mixed research on them, because some studies show that there is little to no effect. Meanwhile, other studies show that they help to reduce soreness. So maybe if you're answering a question that asks you to evaluate, you can look at both sides, referring to one side where studies have shown that they can help to reduce soreness. Meanwhile, the other side showing that ice baths or cold showers don't really have any effect on muscle soreness. Alright, so that is it for this video. If you want to find some exam style questions to help you revise this course or this topic, make sure you check out Super PE online for a bunch of practice worksheets that will help you to be able to take your grades to the next level. Alright, see you then.